Okay, great. So this is our final lecture of the lecture series for WebLab. And afterwards, the next 2 weeks, 1.5 weeks are just for everyone to build their own websites, come to office hours, post on Piazza, and finish up your projects for your final product. Oh, yes. Big announcement today. We have the hackathon at 7 p.m. to 1 a.m. in 32082, I believe. And hackathon is like basically just extended office hours. Like it's not different from previous office hours besides the fact that it's longer. And it's also right before your milestone 2 due date. So like regardless of what point you are at in your web development process, just come to office hours, sit there. If questions come up, put yourself on the queue or join virtually and just put Zoom links on the queue. Okay, so how to win WebLab. This is just a short lecture, overview, wrap up, send off, etc. So the biggest thing is just to plan out your web app. Like we sort of break it down into like milestones to pace, like help everyone pace, but like within each of these milestones, especially milestone 2, which is huge, and also the final product, you should be communicating with your team and just talking about like, oh, which parts I want to do first, which parts like we need to get done for the MVP, which parts are like stretch goals. Like if you try to tackle all the features at once, like it probably just won't work out. Like in the same way that we talk Catbook from HTML and CSS to client side JavaScript to like server side Node.js, Express.js, and using databases and also authentication via Google, like your web apps will work in the same way. So like with all of these different parts of the stack in mind, you should basically focus on designing your own website with the full stack in mind. Like you shouldn't just be focusing on the front end. You shouldn't just be focusing on the back end. Like it should be everything. I mean, so design with all layers of the app in mind and just also design each feature independently.
Cool. So Claire just talked about the sort of things to keep in mind when designing your sites, keeping the full stack in mind. One way that we can do that is going feature by feature. So basically designing each feature independently with the full stack in mind. And we'll go through an example of how we did that in designing Catbook throughout this class. So we're going to specifically talk about designing the profile page feature in Catbook. Basically, the sort of thought process that you should be going through is first creating your detailed wireframes for what you want the profile page to look like. This would be in Figma or a similar technology. And then from there, once you know what your website, what you want it to look like, sort of figuring out what the different components are, what the different React components that fit in that site and work together would be, and figuring out the hierarchy that would imply. Once you figure it out the front end, figure out what each of those different React components, what sort of APIs they need to call, what sort of information they would need from your backend, designing those APIs to accomplish that goal, and also coming up with the corresponding database schemas that would go along to provide any information that those API endpoints might need. So that's the sort of thought process at a very high level. Okay, so the first thing in specific we want to keep in mind is the goal of this feature. So when designing the profile feature of the Catbook website, all we want to do is we want to have a visual display that's, compelling visual display of information about a given user. So going into the first step, wireframing, right? We want to keep in mind we're displaying information about that user. What do we want to show? This is the part where you use your creativity. You can drag around things, drop things in Figma because you don't have to code yet, right? So it should be a lot easier to get your website to look almost exactly like how you want it to look when it's translated to code. This is important so that everyone on your team can be on the same page and agree on something before you actually start coding it up. Once you have that done, the next step should be figuring out how to translate it to front-end components or your React stuff. So maybe you can break it down into different sections like the profile picture or the About Me section. And this is where you would actually want to start thinking about that component hierarchy. After that, you ask, what does the client need from the server in order to get this done? So maybe you would need to pull the user's name from the backend. You would need to get that information. You would need to get their biography for the about me. Maybe you want to also pull their user's cat happiness. And then the last step would be figuring out those database schemas, as we sort of said before. So what do we need to store? Well, we need to store user information, for example, and that user could have certain fields, such as their name, their about me section, their happiness, etc. Okay, so again, to sum it up, when designing our profile feature, right, we want to keep in mind the goal of that feature and then the steps that would lead to successfully creating that full stack feature. All right, Claire, I'll pass it back to you.
Yeah. Hello. Okay. Yeah. So planning ahead will help keep you organized and just also improve productivity, because honestly, 1.5 weeks is not that long. Hopefully, most of you guys have sort of started on your web apps already, but basically plan before working and hopefully it will be okay. And yeah, just also keep your plan updated, because you may have like ideas in the beginning, like, oh, I want to do this feature, I want to do this feature. And later you realize that, oh, it's not actually feasible. We don't actually have enough time, or maybe this other feature would work better and is more efficient. So just keep it updated and like make sure it still stays like feasible and within the time limits. And also just communicate with your team. If you're working with like another person or 2 other people, like just keep communicating. If you're done with a feature, you should let everyone know. Or if you want to change something, like it's really important. Like the GitHub like helps you collaborate, but besides GitHub, you should also be just actively communicating and making sure that everyone's on the same page. And as your team makes decisions, your plans should also be updated and reflect this. Yeah, communicate with your team. I guess I already said that.
Okay. So when we say communicate with your team, we mean like actively communicate, right? Do what works for you. Use what platforms work for you, right? Some teams will use Slack, some teams will use Messenger, some teams will use Discord. But it's important that you're sort of aware of what everyone on the team is doing. Make sure that people are not assigned to overlapping tasks. Otherwise, they might overwrite each other's code, and that doesn't feel good, right? Set a weekly cadence or a daily cadence or whatever works for your team for meeting up and sort of catching each other up on what you've been up to, and as well as setting goals moving forward. A key part of this communication process is effectively and efficiently dividing up the work that you need to do. So maybe one way that you would want to do that is you might want to have some people on your team working on the front end, right? So, and then some people on your team working on the back end. This way that when you're pushing code, you're not really writing anything that directly would be overwriting something that someone else is working on. Maybe you have someone working only on CSS for a bit, just making things look prettier while other people are working on the actual logic and the features. That's another way to separate, but make sure you're thinking about that sort of stuff. Another way to effectively separate people from overriding each other's work and keep them effectively working together is to have different people working on different features, right? So maybe you could have one person working on the full stack feature for the profile page. Maybe you could have one person working on the actual game page. Maybe you could have one person working on the login functionality. As long as the things are effectively separated, that will be an effective way of working together.
Yeah, and like we said, you should be focusing on like one or 2 killer features, the main features of your app that like set it apart from existing websites. So like we value quality over quantity. Like instead of having a large number of features that like work like okay or just like similar to like stuff that's already on the internet, focus on the main point of your app and make those really, really good and really, really impressive. It doesn't need to have a lot of different functionalities for your app to be good. Like for example, like I don't know, Jackbox is like a really popular party game, and it has a few games in there, and like they work really well and they're fun, so people use it. And like maybe they don't have like you know, encompass all the possible games on the internet, and maybe like chat features and stuff are like limited, but like it works well for what it is and people will use it. And same for this. I don't know what this is. It's like a basically like Flappy Bird type game, except it's like a magic carp and like you just jump higher than anyone else. And like that's literally the only functionality in the game, but like it's addicting for people and it's fun. And like honestly, if you build it well, if you build anything well enough, even if the feature sounds dumb, if you build it really well, then people will probably use it. And also just use your team's strengths. So like if you know that someone on your team is like really good at art, really good at design, you know, maybe they should do that. And like, for example, like this is a game that a team of 3 artists made, and that just like focuses a lot on art and maybe less on like adding a bunch of like really complicated features. But since the art is really good, makes like best use of like the team's strengths to make something that's like really, really cool.
Yep. So in addition to using your team's strengths, I think the biggest thing that we want to stress is that you need to test your website a lot. And when we say test, we don't mean like testing necessarily to make sure that your code works, though that is important. We're talking about user testing, right? So maybe everything that we've said up until this point is pretty obvious, and maybe this seems obvious to you as well. But this is actually probably the most important part of your website design process and the part that will take the most time, incorporating user feedback. So after you've made your website, it does what you want it to do. You're making this website to show it to the world, right? And so before you actually make that big release, you're going to need a lot of different opinions to give you feedback on your website so that you can improve it. So what that might look like is you go up to your friend or even someone who you don't know that well to get a more diverse opinion, and you ask, hey, what do you think you're supposed to do? Or maybe you ask them a more targeted question, and you say, hey, try and make this magic carp jump. But the goal here is to see how they interact with your site. Are the things in your site intuitive to use? Is it obvious to the user what they should be doing? If you're making a really great feature, a really cool site, but the people don't know how to use it, that's an ineffective web app. One point that we want to make here, though, is that when you're asking your friends or maybe some people you don't know as well to help you with your website and to provide feedback, you have to love them enough to leave them alone, right? So what this means is you don't want to overwhelm them by asking a bunch of questions, right? You ask them to test out your site, they're already doing you a favor. You don't need to go on and ask them a bunch of questions that are just going to ruin their day. They're going to make them dislike you and not want to talk to you, and you won't get effective user feedback this way. Instead, just do the right amount of advertising to say, hey, I made a cool site. Could you please check it out when you get the time? And get a variety of opinions. Ask your friends, ask your family, ask your friends back from high school, ask your friend who's not course 6, right? Ask some random person if you're, if you want to. Just get as many people to try as possible and give you feedback. That way you can figure out what sorts of things you can improve to give your users the best experience. So yeah, I'll hand it off to Claire.
Yeah, so like Dan said, just test over and over again. When you're building, you build and then test, and then you realize there are some things wrong, and then you polish, and then you repeat this process and again and again. Like robustness is like a pretty important part of your project. Obviously, you should be focusing on like getting your features done and everything, but like making sure it works. Like if it doesn't work, no matter how well you built it, if it breaks while we're testing, then it's not going to win. So like keep in mind that like when we're testing your app, we're not just going to test like the basic like functionalities that like we think that you think that we're supposed to do. Like we're going to try to break your app. So make sure that it's not breakable in any way or shape or form whatsoever, given like whatever you've implemented. And when you're stuck, there are a lot of resources that will make available to help. So obviously Piazza is our biggest one. If you have questions, please post on Piazza. Like someone will respond. And office hours are also a great resource. And we also have a hackathon tonight again. We have a hackathon tonight in 32082 and also online at weblab.2/Q. So please, please, please come and just work on your web app and ask questions and make sure that you know what's going on and know how to build your website, know how to deploy. I don't know if Noah said this, but yeah, just please try to deploy your web app like before the date's due, like even when you're not done, like still try to deploy it. Otherwise, if you run into deployment issues at the last second and you can't deploy your app for milestone 2, then it like won't pass. Like we need it to be deployed for us to be able to access it.
I'm going to jump in real quick here and say deploying should probably be like the first thing that you do. Even so, once you have your skeleton clone, go ahead and just try to deploy it, because that version of the website should be deployable, and that way we can help you figure it out if you're having any bugs then. And it'll be easier to keep deploying it after you've deployed it once.
Yeah, you can deploy it as many times as you want. So like, don't feel like you have to finish the app for you to deploy it. No, like deploy it right now, please. Yeah, and that's basically it. So good luck on your final project. Yeah, reminders, milestone 2 is due on Tuesday at 6 p.m. Eastern time sharp. Please get those, and we will send out a form, I think today. Yeah, it'll be a Google form where you put like your website link and everything. All milestones required to complete or get credit. Do not leave this until the last minute, and hackathon tonight. So yeah, thank you guys for coming. Thanks for sticking with us, and good luck.